Hi everyone, welcome back to another video on OAuth 2.0. In the last video, we discussed the client credentials grant type and looked at a high-level architectural diagram that showed us what that flow looks like. So as promised, in this video, we're going to be doing an actual demonstration by standing up an API, creating a client, and making a request to that API service in order to retrieve an access token. And then we're going to use that access token to successfully hit one of the endpoints on this protected API. Now we're going to be doing all of that using Tyke. Now Tyke is a reverse proxy service that's going to manage our API for us. Now it takes a couple of minutes to install and use, so if you want to pause this video, look in the description and you'll find documentation on how to get started. So let's go ahead and get started here. Alright, so the first thing that we want to do here is go ahead and click on Login. Now we're going to see the overview of the dashboard here and all the different features that we can use to manage and upscale our API. So the first thing that we want to do is scroll down to the APIs section right here and create our first API. So we'll click on Add a new API. Now we'll give this a name, call it OAuth 2.0 Client Credentials. We'll keep the type or protocol of the API as HTTP. And then what we see here is the upstream URL. Now you can substitute this for any API URL that you want to manage through Tyke. Now this is just an echo server. I'll keep this as is for now. We'll go ahead and click on Configure API. Now we'll scroll all the way to the bottom here at the Authentication section. Now we want to set this to OAuth 2.0. And now here we see the different grant types that we're going to be talking about in the next few videos. In the last video and in this video, we want to talk about the client credentials, so we'll go ahead and click that. Now for allowed authorized types, we want to select token, and we'll select authorization code as well. We'll keep all of this blank here. The only thing that we care about underneath is the header name. Now the header name, if we look back to our diagram, is going to include that encoded client ID and secret. So we want to keep this in mind here. Here's the header name authorization. We'll make sure it lines up. Yes, it does. We'll go ahead and click save here. Now, if we click back into our API, that's it. There's our API URL that's managed through Tyke and is currently protected using OAuth 2.0. So if I actually go and hit this API, you'll see that I'm required to put an authorization field. All right, so if we go back to our diagram, and here's why these diagrams are so amazing, is because they literally lay out step by step what we have to do in order to complete this flow. So we know ultimately that we want an access token in order to actually access the API. Now before that, we have to make an access token request from the API client to the API gateway. Now the API gateway is already created, so we just have to create the API client. Now just before we do that, we do need to create a policy. Now a policy is going to manage the delegation to our API. So when we create a token, it's going to manage how that token is used in the context of our API. So let's go ahead and create add policy here. And now we'll select the API that we just created. Perfect. And then we'll give this policy a name and we'll say OAuth 2.0 client policy. And we'll select these keys and make sure that they never expire here. Perfect. And create add policy. So now we can go back to our API and complete step 1 of this flow, which is to create an API client. Now going to my API, here it is. If I click on Actions, OAuth Clients, click on Add New Client here. And now here we have the redirect URI. Now this is going to be mandatory for the purposes of this demonstration. We'll just go ahead and put a dummy URL here, so example.com. And we do need to select the policy for our API. And the policy that's attached here is the client policy. Perfect, so now that that's all done, all we're gonna do is click on add here to add this URI to our list, and then click on create. And now we see that our client is officially created. So going back to our diagram, we've now created the client, we've created the gateway, and now all we have to do to initiate and pretty much complete this request is send this off in order to retrieve an access token. Now what do we need to include in this post request? What we have to include is the client ID and secret. Now we have that here. Here's the ID and here's the secret. And we do have to convert that to base 64. So I'm going to pull up an encoder here. And it's literally going to be as easy as taking the ID, throwing that in there, appending a colon, and then taking the secret and doing the same thing. And we'll get rid of that white space there. Let's go ahead and click on encode. And now we have a key here, which we're going to use in our authorization header. So let's go ahead and bring up Postman and go and shoot this request off. So I'll create a new workspace. Now it's asking for my method type. It's going to be a post method if you follow the diagram. Post method to the API URL appended with the listen path, and then that special OAuth token endpoint that we talked about earlier. So let's go back to our API in a new tab here. Click on the API that we created. Here's our API URL with the listen path. And now we'll add OAuth token. Perfect. And now if we go into the header section, we'll create the authorization header. And we'll name this basic. And then we'll just paste that token. Whoops, that's not it. Here it is. Paste that key value here that we created. We coded in base 64. Make sure there's just one space there. Perfect. And now we want to add the content type, which is going to be application. And then we're going to make sure it's form URL encoded. There it is. Perfect. And now if we go into the body, we also want to add a couple of things here. Now this is going to be selected as form URL encoded. Now we'll add the grant type as client credentials. And then what else do we need to add here? Let's look back at our diagram. So the body includes the grant type as client credentials. We'll also add values for the client ID and the client secret. And again, like we talked about earlier, this is the actual raw value that we're going to be including here, not the encoded value. Oops, secret, perfect. Now we'll go back to our client, copy that, paste that in here. Let's take the secret as well. Also paste that in there. Awesome. And now we should be ready to go ahead and fire off this post request to our OAuth token endpoint and then retrieve an access token. And there it is. So just like we looked at before, here is the returned response, and it's going to include the access token that we can use to hit this protected endpoint on this protected API. And we also have an expiry time for this token, as well as the token type, which is of type bearer. So let's go ahead and hit this endpoint using this token and make sure that this works. Alright, so all we're going to do here is open up a new tab in Postman, and then go back to our API, copy the API URL, go back here, paste that, make sure that this is set to the get method instead of a post. And now let's hit one of these endpoints on our protected API, let's say the XML endpoint. And now we go back to the header section. Let's set an authorization header. We'll set the value to bearer. We'll go back to our access token response here, copy the token, and paste that as the value to our authorization header. And now we'll go ahead and click send, and we see that now we can access this endpoint on our OAuth 2 protected API. So ultimately, we talked at the very beginning about the different grant types. What separates the grant types from each other? Well, that key separation essentially is just how we actually get that access token, which we need to access the API, right? So the methods of retrieving that access token are going to differ from grant type to grant type, but the end goal is to receive an access token, which is what is going to be needed here to access an OAuth 2 protected API. So we talked about the client credentials grant type. We protected our API. We were able to successfully retrieve an access token to hit one of the endpoints on our protected API. Now in the next video, we'll go over the next grant type that we're going to talk about and repeat this process using the logic from that grant type. Alrighty folks, that's all for today. If you found this video helpful, feel free to like and share with anyone else who might find it useful. And if you had any questions throughout the video about OAuth or getting started with Tyke, then check out the description for key resources or leave a comment below to get a quick answer from me. Be sure to check out the other videos in this series on OAuth 2.0, and until then, see you in the next one.